I'll do a test. Welcome, everybody, and on the live stream, welcome to the 17th Sankey Lecture at Brock University. We're really glad to be able to welcome you here again today. I just want to make an announcement at the start of the session to say that we'll get going in about 5 or 10 minutes. Let things get settled, let you all get settled, and the stragglers come in from the rainy outdoors. So in the meantime, I'll play a little bit of Oscar Peterson and maybe Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and we'll get started with the event very soon. Thank you for coming, and thank you for joining us online. So I will say, if you're online, if you could please give us a little note. Where are you watching from? Where are you? How many are in your group? That would be wonderful. It'll be a chance for us then to test out the live stream. So please, do give us a little note in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, let's see where else. Oh, Cambridge, Ontario, Kingston, Hamilton, hello Hamilton, and Brantford, yes, Chatham District, London, Ontario, Caledonia, Amity Lodge in Niagara, Waterdown, oh, from Mannheim, Germany, hello Mannheim, Germany. Who might that be? Hello, Barbara. The Burns Lodge in Sarnia District, Chapleau. We've also got, oh, let's see. We've got a greeting from London, England. So, London, England, hello to you. Let's see. Watford, Ontario. Frederick, Maryland. Frederick, Maryland, hello. Oxford, UK. Hello, Oxford, UK. I'm not sure where that is, but sounds important. From New York as well, from Ottawa, from Morristown, New Jersey. So we've got an international crowd here today. And from Quebec City. greetings to you all, and we will be getting going soon. I hope you can hear my voice over the tinkle of Oscar Peterson and the trio. Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for your patience. We are about to get started for the 17th annual Sankey Lecture. It seems like a blip in time for me. I recognize many faces of you here today. Many of you are regular guests as part of the series. My name is Professor Mike Dreger of the History Department. Some of you already know me, and some of you I hope to get to know for the first time today, maybe at the reception after the event. I have helped coordinate this wonderful lecture series over a number of years, more than a decade now, in fact, together with great colleagues such as our guest today, Professor Susan Sommers from Pennsylvania. I will tell you more about her in just a few moments. We will get started now, and I would like to also not just welcome you who are here in the room with us today, but also some distinguished guests, such as Jamie Ireland, the Grand Master of the Provincial Masons right now. Very good to see you, Jamie Ireland, Grand Master. And there's at least one other past Grand Master in the hall, David Cameron. Really good to see you as well, right in the back of the room. Hello, David. So, perhaps there are some others as well. Greetings to you all. And online also, big greetings. So we're glad you can join us on the live stream. There is a chat. You can say hello to others in the chat, and when the talk is ongoing, you might save up your questions, or if you think of a question that you would like us to consider after the lecture is over, you can add it to the chat. This is, as I already mentioned, the 17th annual lecture in our series. It's been a great bit of teamwork between the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario, quite a name, I like it, or the Ontario Masons for short, and the History Department of Brock University. I will remind you that as guests here, it might be good to take your devices and put them on stun, or if you're not a Star Trek fan, at least make sure they're on silent mode. I have to double check that with mine regularly. That's one small note. You can, in the audience, also contribute to the live chat by typing in questions through the YouTube stream. The live chat, if you would like to share it with anyone, is, where are we here? Live at Sankey Lecture, or .sankeylectures.ca, a simple live stream address. This is a lecture series, the Sankey Lecture Series, that has brought people from all over Ontario to visit Brock over many years, and also from Upper New York State and several places around the world, because our speakers have come from Pennsylvania and other places in the United States, from several locations in Canada, and also from England and France. So if you're joining us from anywhere else, particularly overseas, we really welcome you today and would like to continue this connection over the next several years. Of course, one of the things that's new in the Sankey Lecture Series now is that we have had the live stream over a number of years. It began, of course, like so many of these events, with COVID. And for 3 years, the lecture series was online. Those lectures, together with all of the previous lectures except last year's, are already available online. So you can, after this lecture, look at some of the past ones. It's quite a catalog that we have, and there have been hundreds of people like you who visited and revisited Brock University. Another thing that's changed is that because we're online, our local audiences are much cozier. That means we'll get a chance to chat and maybe get to talk with each of you today. So please do, if you can, plan to join us for refreshments and a reception afterwards to meet Professor Sommers. This lecture series has been a wonderful enrichment for Brock University and for our students, particularly in our master's program. And with the generosity of Ontario's Masons, the university, together with the Grand Lodge, has been able to fund a graduate fellowship that has already supported a number of master's students in history. And I would like to invite one of those students to join us right now and tell you a little bit more about his research, which the Grand Lodge is supporting, and which has, I believe, a Freemason research connection. So I'll invite Ethan Monsian from the History Department to come up to the podium now. Ethan.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, wow, that's nice. Good sound quality. Thank you so much, Professor Dreger. And thank you, again, to everyone for coming out today and tuning in online in that. My name is Ethan, and so I'm a MA student in the history program at Brock, and I'll just go into my research now. So I just want to say, my apologies in advance if this hits a little bit too close to home, but picture this, everyone. You are tasked with defending Canada from the invading Americans. What would be top on your priority list? Probably defensible fortifications, right? Building big forts. Maybe weapons or training personnel, things like that. What about food? Food is not often what leaps to mind first when we think of traditional approaches to analyzing historical conflicts, but there's a reason for this saying that an army travels on its stomach. What do we need for any mobilization in any time period? Food. And yet the logistics of provisioning shift with time and place. Provisioning within the unique environment of the Great Lakes Basin is exactly what people in Canada were tasked with during the War of 1812. That's what they faced, and what I'm examining is the role of a British naval unit called the Provincial Marine. Now, I'd just like to sort of get a sense, aside from the people here who I've already talked to about this thesis research, who here has heard of the Provincial Marine? Show of hands. Go, couple, 1, 2, 3. Yep, Professor Dreger, of course. Not too many more. That's what I thought. That's good. That means I'm doing original research. These guys are not well known. And thank you for listening now about them. So throughout this conflict, war of attrition tactics reigned supreme and rained down terror on the populations as both Americans and British Canadians fell victim to and perpetrated raids of supplies, weapons, and most importantly for my line of inquiry, provisions or food. Now, the War of 1812 is not often explored as a genocidal war, but it really was when you think of the American policy towards especially the indigenous nations of the continental interior. The Americans were expanding into their lands, just massacring villages. And this was one of the major causes of the war. They viewed them as savages standing in the way of white American progress, and they used war of attrition tactics, the American military, such as burning crops and looting houses and things like this, and against these indigenous nations and against their British Canadian allies. I'll say most of the indigenous nations, not all, but most, they allied themselves at this time with the British Canadians because at that particular time, the British Canadians were much less aggressively expansionist than the Americans were. American General William Hull, for instance, commanding the early invasion, he issued a proclamation saying that if an allied indigenous and British Canadian force dared to resist, quote, "This will be a war of extermination. The first stroke with the tomahawk will be the signal for one indiscriminate scene of desolation." I won't say too much more than that since I know we have some young ones in the audience. But I think that is one thing that is just not well known about this war, just how high the stakes were. Now, as the invasion of Canada wears on, the Niagara Peninsula, one of the major battlegrounds of the war, is also an agricultural powerhouse, and you need to get those massive amounts of food around the province quickly. So how do you keep people fed in these circumstances? Well, the highways are the waterways of the day. Sorry, excuse me, I got that backwards. The waterways are the highways of the day. Enter the Provincial Marine. These guys were a small, unique, and often maligned Canadian task force, and they'd been created during the 7 Years' War, 6 decades before, for two purposes: fighting on the lakes and transporting troops and stores. Now, they were sort of like a separate navy for the inland waterways of North America, especially the Great Lakes or inland seas. And if an army travels on its stomach, so does a navy. And the garrisons needed not just stores of weapons, but also stores of food. Now, during the 7 Years' War and American Revolution, the Provincial Marine had served as the main naval force on the inland waterways. In peacetime, they'd kind of just become a transport service for the military, and by the time the War of 1812 broke out, the high command of the military was like, "All right, guys, time to turn it on. Elbows up!" And the Provincial Marine was kind of like, "Guys, our guns haven't fired in like 25 years. What do you want from us?" And so it was that you had Reverend John Strawn saying mean things like, "Our Navy is worse than nothing." Fair enough, Reverend Strawn. The Provincial Marine had the opportunity to press their advantage of greater numbers and organization in the early days of the war, and they blew it. They failed to mount a serious opposition militarily until the Royal Navy came to back them up in April to May of 1813. But remember, fighting was not their only job. Keeping the military supplied was equally their task, and while they did not gain control of the lakes in the early days of the war, here's the thing, neither did the Americans. So what I'm looking at is the Provincial Marines' provisioning efforts on the high inland seas, keeping those food supply lines open and going during the war. To stay supplied, you need two things, the supplies themselves and the ability to transport them. And the Provincial Marine were both transporting provisions themselves, and they were keeping the Americans from gaining mastery of Lake Ontario and cutting off that supply line. So they were there at the Battle of Detroit, for instance, where Brock and Tecumseh took the fort with very little bloodshed, relatively speaking. And they were there keeping those communications coming and those supplies coming across that river. So therefore, I'm paying attention not just to the food itself, but to the guns that guarded it and the waterways it traveled on as well, or something academics call foodways, how people procured food or got their food, prepared it, and what it meant to them. And so I bet you're wondering, are there any Masonic connections here? I know Professor Dreger alluded to this, so yes, absolutely. And one of the particular things I wish to elucidate with further research is the precise nature of the relationship between civilian Masonic merchants, such as Robert Hamilton, Queenston merchant, and Finn and Ellis of the Finn and Ellis Company of Schenectady, New York, and kind of how they use their Masonic network to, well, network their way in and keep up good relations with the more governmental and military Freemasons, such as Sir John Graves Simcoe, first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. He was a Freemason, and during his tenure as Lieutenant Governor, the Provincial Marine would have been directly under his command. And so, as well as, Alexander Grant was a Provincial Marine commander, and men like, Sir William Johnson and that, how did this kind of whole network, in terms of working with the civilian merchants and the Provincial Marine, to have naval support for merchant vessels on the lakes and keep them, kind of open and coming and safe. How did all that work? That's one of the things I wish to elucidate further. So to finish off, to borrow an appropriate expression from the great historian Natalie Zeman Davis, what harvest do I hope to yield here? I think what the significance of this study is to explore how people fed themselves in a war of attrition. And this is a context, tragically, all too well known to many people right now. So essentially, I wish to explore this question: how did the Provincial Marines' provisioning efforts function during the war? And what significance did their efforts have to the people whose lives they touched? And both for the Masonic connection and for just broader interest in this sort of research and scholarship, I just want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart to the Ontario Masons for providing the financial support for this research and putting your confidence in me to carry it to fruition. So thank you just so much, and thank you to everyone for listening. I can't wait to hear Dr. Sommers' presentation.
Thank you very much, Ethan. So now it is my pleasure as MC to welcome back to St. Catharines and to Brock University Professor Susan Mitchell Sommers. Professor Sommers first came to Brock University to deliver the 2015 Sankey Lecture. During that visit, she told our audiences, and maybe some of you, about the Masonic empire of Thomas Dunkerley in the 18th century. This is a subject about which she has already written a book, and if you're curious to learn more about the subject or refresh your memory, you can go back to this Sankey Lectures website and check out the 2015 lecture. And there you can learn more about Masonic stories of intrigue in the 18th century. Following up on that visit in 2015, Susan came back in 2016 to participate in the lecture of her research colleague and friend, Professor Andrew Prescott. And hello, Andrew. who also spoke about a subject in early 18th century Masonic studies. Professor Sommers is an expert in 18th century British history and the history of fraternalism. Her fascination with 18th century subjects, I believe, started early on in life. That's one thing I've just discovered over the last few days. As a young person, she contributed to historical reenactments of 18th century life. And I guess that experience was so visceral and long-lasting that you just made that your profession, in effect. She built upon her early life experiences with her historical reenactment parents, but in her university studies. Her PhD is from Washington University, which is in St. Louis, makes sense. And she taught modern history at St. Vincent College for about 30 years before retiring recently. So, congratulations. She remains very active in Freemason studies. Earlier in March of this year, she was in California to lead the International Conference on Freemasonry held at the University of California at Berkeley. Some people might have heard of it. It's one of the premier universities in the world, and for Masonic studies. California has been a hub of Masonic studies like Brock University because of the engagement over many years of another one of our Sankey lecturers, Professor Peg Margaret Jacob. And Susan has been her successor in that series. She's coordinated this annual conference for several years already, 8 years already. So that conference in California, coordinated through the Grand Lodge of California and the University of California system, together with the Sankey Lecture Series, are two of the premier North American fraternalism and Masonic studies programs. We're lucky to have you back here, Susan, to join us for your third visit to talk about your ongoing research into the life and career of James Anderson of the famous Anderson Constitutions. If you are not familiar with them, you will learn a good deal. I am so honored to welcome you back, Susan, officially.
There's me. Keep going. Yeah, I know. I'm just gazing. Is that right? Okay. So, those of you who have been familiar with my work over the past few decades know that I dig way down deep to find personal anecdotes and unknown aspects of famous Freemasons' lives. And what I find again and again and again is that they're just like all the rest of us. They're not perfect, just like none of the rest of us are. But today I'll be talking about James Anderson. Before I begin, let me express my deep gratitude to Mike and the other members of the faculty here at the university, and to the broader academic and Masonic communities in Ontario. I'm really delighted and honored to be part of this ongoing lecture series. Charles Sankey was devoted to Masonic studies as well, but I can't help but wonder what he would think about what I have to say this afternoon. So, without further ado, let me begin. Whoops, there we go. In 1720, an audible snicker rippled across London as a controversial Presbyterian clergyman was mocked in two scurrilous pamphlets, Priapia Presbyteriana, the Presbyterian Peasel, rapidly followed by Anti-Priapia Presbyteriana, or an answer to the Priapia Presbyteriana. In each, James Anderson, who lived from 1679 to 1739 and was a minister to the Scots Presbyterian Church in St. James, London, is named. And in one, he is chastised as if in mid-sermon from his pulpit. Quit, quit, for shame, thy canting stuff, thy feigned ecstasies and raptures, and thy burlesquing of the scriptures. Quit thy tub rhapsodies and nonsense, and thy protesting on thy conscience. Quit thy downed looks and squeed out tears, and thy long, long blasphemous prayers. Quit thy pretensions unto grace, the hems and haws and set form face, the sniveling nose and the lubber lips, and thy communion sitting hips. Pretty tough stuff. Even if you don't follow the period slang in its entirety, the message is plain. Anderson is a spiritual fraud, guilty of the worst sort of melodramatic posturing. Further, the pamphlet titles, both of which compare him to the unfortunate classical god Priapus, are evidence that he was accused of sexual offense. But was he really an egregious cant with a bad case of syphilis, as the pamphlets claim? This is an attack on a man who was perhaps more than anybody else at the time a visible representative of the Scottish Kirk, or the established Presbyterian Church. The pamphlets mock Anderson, whom one calls the Kirk's missionary at London. I can tell you that the Kirk thought of him as that too. And they mock him for his rampant sexual improprieties, but their focus is also on his alien nationality and his foreign church. He is a Scottish Presbyterian, a nonconformist, set up to preach in the shadow of the Church of St. James, Westminster, a person to be feared and distrusted. He is out to seduce his neighbors' wives and daughters, and his book of constitutions is coming to your Masonic Lodge in the very near future. The Priapia pamphlets belong to what was by then already an old and not terribly clever literary trope, and one which incidentally figures in Anderson's personal experience. In 1697, while he was still a student at the University in Aberdeen, he was summoned to testify against William Abercrombie, minister at Lauder, who had asserted in Anderson's presence that, quote, the way to be a Presbyterian minister was to speak nonsense with confidence, unquote. Now the tables were turned, and it was Anderson who was accused of spouting nonsense. What exactly was he saying, especially in his publications, to attract such venom? Specifically, what did those writings, including the Masonic Book of Constitutions, reveal about Anderson's religious beliefs? Why, as Masons and scholars of Freemasonry, should we care? I will examine this question through the lens of the three most significant books he published in the last decade of his life, the 1730s. Royal Genealogies was published in 1732. Unity in Trinity and Trinity in Unity, I'll let you guess what that's about, was published in 1733. And the second edition of the Masonic Book of Constitutions was published in 1738, the year before he died. And of course, we will nod in the direction of the 1723 edition of the Constitutions as well. Apart from the 1723 Constitutions, all the other books we're going to mention today were the culmination of his work begun in previous decades and are firmly grounded in his education, his various intellectual engagements, and Orthodox Calvinist theology. I argue that he was in many ways a typical, or at least a consistent, Scottish Presbyterian clergyman of his time, though adrift in London, where his fidelity to the Scottish Kirk made him the odd man out. Further, he was simultaneously a significant, though now unsung figure of the early Scottish Enlightenment. Perhaps his importance in this regard has been overlooked because his name has been so strongly associated with Freemasonry and little else. Oh, good, I went in the right direction. This is Aberdeen, or at least part of old Aberdeen. Anderson was educated in Aberdeen, Scotland from 1694 to 1702, attending Aberdeen Grammar School, which was a Latin school, and Marshall College, where he studied arts and graduate theology. At Marshall, as in all the ancient Scottish universities, the curriculum was updated by educational reforms introduced to Scotland by a dense web of personal and institutional connections to the largely continental Republic of Letters, as detailed by Esther Meyer in her useful study of the ties that bound Scottish scholars to universities in the Low Countries between 1650 and 1750. At every juncture in Anderson's education and his later career as a minister in London, Anderson was examined for religious orthodoxy, and he swore fidelity to the established Kirk of Scotland and the Westminster Confession of Faith. This foundational Calvinist document, written in 1646 in England and reaffirmed in Scotland during Anderson's lifetime in 1690, was the Kirk's standard for faith and practice, subordinate only to the Bible, which was, of course, considered infallible. Anderson's assimilation of its tenets profoundly informed all of his published works. Anderson wished to be remembered as a scholar, as demonstrated by his 1732 book, Royal Genealogies, or the genealogical tables of emperors, kings, and princes from Adam to these times in 2 parts. It's a massive work, 854 pages, and undoubtedly took longer to research and write than the 7 years to which Anderson admits. Royal Genealogies amply supports my claim that Anderson was a trailblazer in the Scottish Enlightenment, which scholars have previously located in the second half of the 18th century rather than the first half. Anderson demonstrates that key aspects of the Scottish Enlightenment, including especially, let me start this over. Anderson demonstrates that these aspects began to appear much earlier in the century. Anderson's work is characteristic of most of the writing that comes afterward, especially including his brother Adam's 1765 work and historical and chronological deduction of the origin of commerce. Royal Genealogies is a comprehensive history. It's a comprehensive history of his topic, which is one of the things that the Scottish Enlightenment indulged in, comprehensive histories. Anderson resorts to conjecture. Conjectural history is another key component of the Scottish Enlightenment. If you don't have evidence, make up something plausible. Make up something that makes sense. And he acknowledges his reliance on 16th and 17th century chronologers to synchronize the ages and dynasties of man together into a coherent whole. The field of chronology focused on the reconciliation of biblical and secular sources to establish a true timeline of human history. And so it was fraught with religious implications, as non-Christian narratives began to establish events that were demonstrably prior to biblical creation. Anderson owned several works by French Calvinist Joseph Justus Scalier, sorry about that, whose 1583 Opus Novum de Emendatione Temporum did just that. And it caused reverberations that lasted through the 18th century. How could things happen before creation? Anderson's connection in print to Scaliger, I got it that time, and other important continental scholars is confirmed both in royal genealogies, where he acknowledges his use of their works, and in their appearance in the contents of the posthumous sale catalog of his own working library, which contains at least 20 volumes dedicated to chronology. This was one of those wonderful finds. Gentlemen collected libraries in the 18th century. And when they died, they put forward in their will that, you know, my son gets my books on law and my brother gets my French novels, and then everything else would be sold. And this is a primary way other gentlemen composed their libraries. These sale catalogs were never supposed to last. They were ephemera. And as far as I know, only one example of the sale catalog from Anderson's book sale survived. And so we know what was in his library, which I think is really pretty remarkable and it's very helpful. Anderson's genealogical opus began as a straightforward translation of a work by German choreographer and genealogist Johann Hübner, who died in 1731. Given Anderson's obsessive approach to scholarship, the work soon turned into something larger, that's one page, larger and more original than its inspiration. Anderson's style was, in his words, copious and plain, assimilating all the sources he could acquire or gain access to. It was indeed copious, but not at all plain. He makes it clear in the preface and elsewhere that he sees this project as an ongoing concern, a body of scholarship he can use in the future to compose family histories for any British aristocrats willing to pay handsomely. Anderson focuses on chronology and its twin, genealogy, because the ages of man, of course, were measured in the reigns and dynasties of kings. So when you put all the genealogies together into the right timeline, you surely understand it all. Combined, the two disciplines form the structure of history. And Anderson argues that his finished work is, quote, an abridgment of universal history, unquote, and may be used as an index or dictionary to all history. He offers the work as a concordance for scholars and students and a corrective to other works, quote, whose authors have either been ignorant or negligent of chronology and genealogy, without which any history is deficient, imperfect, and perplexing, unquote. I think my students would have agreed about that, right? Anderson hoped this publication would establish his stature as an intellectual and that it would sell well. It needed to sell because unlike all of his other publications, including both editions of the Constitutions, he owned the copyright for this. He didn't own it for any of the other works, and especially for the two editions of the Constitutions of the Freemasons, he was paid by the page. So it needed to sell. He owned the copyright. He was responsible for all the costs associated with its publication and sale. Anderson reassures those who peruse the preface that he, quote, has avoided all terms and expressions that may give offense to any nation or family, to any party or person, having nothing to do with the national controversies of historians, nor with the ecclesiastical and religious debates of theologians, nor with the politics of statesmen, unquote. Instead, and this is my favorite line in this whole almost 900-page book, he promises to, quote, allow every nation to enjoy its own fable, unquote. Within the safe confines, of course, of the widely approved chronology devised by Anglo-Irish Bishop James Ussher, who died in 1656, which sensibly begins with the creation at precisely 6:00 p.m. on the 22nd of October, 4004 BCE. Even though Anderson lined up a number of prominent booksellers named on the title page, sales were disappointing. In the end, Anderson was acknowledged by a eulogist as, quote, a gentleman who by more than 20 years' study gave the world a book of inconceivable labor and universal use, unquote. Nonetheless, the expense of research and paying for publication left him deeply in debt, which, coupled with his own improvidence, helped send him to the Fleet prison for 3 years for debt, which was a sad recompense. The year after Royal Genealogies was published, Anderson produced his main theological work, Unity in Trinity and Trinity in Unity, a copy of which he presented to Marshall College Library in Aberdeen in gratitude for an honorary doctorate in divinity he sought and was awarded in 1731. I've been following up on this one point lately, which has involved hours and hours and hours of reading 17th and 18th century Scots Presbyterian synod records, synod minutes, session minutes, Presbyterian minutes, General Assembly minutes. They're microfilmed, they're manuscript. I'm reading them online, and I think I need to go get new glasses. But let me tell you about this. In the 18th century, it was impossible to earn a doctorate. It just didn't happen. There were no programs of study in England or in Scotland or in Wales that would give that degree. And the same is not true for places on the continent. So many people have questioned Anderson's doctorate in divinity, but it was just as legitimate as anybody else's was. You wrote off to the college, you paid your money, you got your diploma, and everyone was happy. Well, it's one thing to play with people's souls like that. But the truth is, that's the way you could get a medical doctorate as well. And that's a little unsettling, I think. It depends on your point of view. The doctorate in divinity he got was awarded in part because he asked for it, and he was an alum, and he paid for it. And his brother was the chair of divinity at the other college in his hometown. But also because he was Orthodox. What does that mean? He was devoted to the Westminster Confession, and a brief description of some of its primary points is a help for what follows. The Westminster Confession states that the Pope is the Antichrist, that the Catholic Mass is idolatry, and it prohibits marriage to Catholics. More controversially, even among Protestants, the confession requires belief in predestination, both to salvation and damnation. In either case, life after death is eternal. And finally, even believers who are destined for salvation, or what was called election, are nonetheless totally depraved by reason of original sin. They achieve salvation through God's grace and Christ's sacrifice, and the sinner himself has nothing to do with the outcome. If that sounds a little harsh, many of Anderson's contemporaries, even in nonconformist circles, agreed. In 1719, Anderson was involved in something called the Salters Hall debates, which were, well, I should tell you, in early modern London, the biggest rooms, the places that had halls that you could rent for a conference like this, belonged to the powerful guilds in the city of London. And so these debates have nothing at all to do with salt or salters, except they were held in the Salters Hall. And this is a cartoon of it. These debates, which were between different kinds of nonconformists or dissenters, these are people who do not belong to the Church of England, and so are excluded from various activities that a citizen, a male citizen, sorry ladies, a male citizen could otherwise expect to participate in, like going to the university or holding a high military position. Nonconformists could be cannon fodder, but they could not be generals. And so this is an important thing for these people. They have governance over their religion. They have freedom to worship. And that's pretty much all they have going for them. You know, they can't aspire to be a prime minister or anything like that. So what happens? By the time we get to 1719, there are schisms and fractures emerging between different kinds of English nonconformists. They no longer agreed on orthodoxy. This series of debates held in the Salters Livery Company in London, the primary focus of the debates was whether belief in the Trinity was justified by Scripture, and if so, whether it was then permissible to require non-conforming ministers to subscribe to it. Tempers ran really high amongst the 100 or so nonconformist ministers gathered from London and surrounding towns. A probably apocryphal account is pictured here. This tells us that the ministers divided into those who were against persecution, that was their own, for not agreeing to subscribing, putting their name on an endorsement for the scriptural authenticity of the Trinity. And they stayed below. So you see them sitting there in their pews. And those who favored the proposed requirement, who went up to the gallery. And you can see there are little bubbles, little ribbon-like bubbles saying, you know, all of you who endorse the Bible, come up. So what happens? Anderson went up, but when the voting came to a second round, he was on the losing side. He pursued that point for the rest of his life, defending it in his dissertation, The Unity and Trinity, and enshrining it in changes he made to the first Masonic charge of the 1738 edition of the Book of Constitutions. Anderson took his time mulling over, getting to the right, getting to the right. There we go. Took his time mulling over the problem of non-Trinitarian Christians. How can such a thing exist? And then in 1733, he published Unity in Trinity and Trinity in Unity. I have read it, so you don't have to. It's tedious, and it's thorough, and it serves to dispel the notion that Anderson was sympathetic to anything other than strictly Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity. The structure of the work is modeled on the way biblical proofs are presented in the Westminster Confession, but he does not limit himself to scripture to support his argument. This work is a demonstration of his theological and historical scholarship, with flourishes towards a showy erudition. Anderson cites all manners of sources: Greek, Roman, biblical, Talmudic, the Apocrypha, the early church fathers. He even praises Muslims for respectful treatment of Jesus in their teaching. Anderson denounces all wicked Christian polytheists, from Catholics to Arians and Socinians, Unitarians, but also misers, voluptuaries, ambitious men, and those who fear Satan so much that they raise him up to rival God. He then goes on to deflate the confidence of mathematicians, natural philosophers, and all who believe that reason is a sufficient guide to religious truth. It is not. Anderson affirms the principle of election. Do you all know what election means? Before the beginning of all time, God decided who would be saved and who would be damned. Those who will be saved are elected. And there's really nothing they can do to wriggle out of it. And there's really nothing anyone else can do to join that flock. Anderson affirms this principle twice in the treatise, but he declines to argue that only Reformed or Calvinist Christians will be saved, asserting that, quote unquote, secret things belong to God. So you wouldn't have to believe in Calvinism to be saved, or not. Everything in this work, Anderson was not an innovative theologian, but he didn't need to be. Everything important had already been revealed and proved. He was just there to reiterate that orthodoxy was unassailable. Anderson addresses another preoccupation of the Scottish Enlightenment in this work, the problem of origins. If I had a penny for every time an earnest Masonic member of an audience has come up to me and said, you know, I'm really interested in studying, finding out the origin of Freemasonry, I'd be rich. I'd take us all out for lunch. This fascination with origins is certainly part of the Enlightenment, part of the Scottish Enlightenment, part of the DNA of Western intellectual preoccupations. This fascination for origins could be imposed on any historical topic. His brother Adam wrote a comprehensive history of British commerce and empire from the very beginning. It's 1,000 pages long. James fixes on the origin of true religion. In the process, he explores and defines a term many will recognize from his Masonic writings. Quote, the religion in which all men agree, unquote. Unsurprisingly, Anderson demonstrates that this is the religion of the biblical patriarchs, and that distorted traces of it can still be found in the world's religions even now. In his estimation, only Orthodox Christians have held fast to the core beliefs of the true religion, which remain unchanged from the days of Noah, who in Anderson's hands bears an uncanny theological similarity to Scots Presbyterians. Anderson arranges these beliefs in three interrelated groups, foreshadowing the three great articles of Noah of the 1738 Constitution. The most important is the belief in the Trinity. But since the Trinity cannot be discerned by reason alone, the second is the necessity of revelation contained in Scripture as the infallible rule of life and faith. Finally, immortality of the soul. Though whether this is eternal bliss or torment, of course, depends on your electoral status. Anderson argues that this is what the antediluvian patriarchs believed, with the exception of Scripture, which they had directly from God, and which he terms traditional revelation. Anderson's not a particularly original thinker in his search for the original religion of mankind. He shares this fascination with the origins of true religion with many other early modern scholars, and they are amply represented in the catalog of his library. This obsession with origins is what led early modern scholars to focus on the ancient art of chronology, as we've already seen. Anderson's education and the contents of his library argue that he had the historical, genealogical, philological, mathematical, even the astronomical skills and reference works to verify a given reconciliation between biblical and secular or Gentile dating, which is what chronology was all about. But he spared himself the heavy lifting. He didn't propose an original system of reconciliation. His contemporary Sir Isaac Newton did, but Newton was afraid to have it published before he died for fear that it would hasten him to the grave. The place Anderson is compelled to innovate was in the Book of Constitutions, because he was the originator of that genre of printed Masonic handbooks. While that freed his hands somewhat, what do you need? They're trying to get me to do something. No? Okay. Magic people off screen. He was the originator of that genre of printed Masonic handbooks. While that freed his hands somewhat, he was also bound to include what the new Grand Lodge in London requested, which Desaguliers reports in the dedication to the 1723 edition, and that is to compile, quote, and digest this book from the old records, and how accurately he has compared and made everything agreeable to history and chronology, so as to render these new constitutions a just and exact account of Masonry from the beginning of the world to your Grace's mastership, still preserving all that was truly ancient and authentic in the old ones. Well, nothing about Anderson's relationship with Freemasonry or the composition of the Book of Constitutions was straightforward. And here is neither time nor place to straighten the story out. It's enough to say that when Anderson was forced to innovate, the results were very uneven. Weaving together an authentic history of Masonry from Adam to the present would have been beyond anyone's abilities, and was especially so given the limited resources Anderson had to work with: unspecified general records, traditions, the old charges he could get his hands on, most importantly, the Cook manuscript. He brought to the task his knowledge of history and chronology, and fashioning a document that twinned the evolution of architecture with the lineage of the Grand Masters of Freemasonry, he hoped for the best. Well, what Anderson produced in 1723 was conjectural history at its most conjectural. Early in the account, scarcely a sentence is not qualified by supposition. By 1735, James Anderson, our learned author of the Constitutions, had been deprived of his ministerial pulpit. His marriage seems to have broken down, and he was incarcerated in the Fleet Prison in London for debt. It was bleak. It seemed to be a very good time for him to solicit a commission from the Grand Lodge to publish a second edition of the Constitutions. Grand Lodge officers agreed. The organization had come through nearly 15 years of growth and growing pains, and the Grand Lodge Minute Book specifically records the specific requests for new sections in the book, which would help forestall future spurious claims on Grand Lodge charity. Grand Lodge had scarcely come into being in 1721 when people started coming out of the woodwork saying, oh yeah, I used to be Grand Master and I'm having trouble now and I would like charity. What do you mean you were Grand Master? So what they wanted was a list that they could compare to people who wandered in off the street and claimed to have a legitimate reason for asking for charity. So here is what the Grand Lodge Minute Book says. Then a motion was made that Dr. James Anderson should be desired to print the names in his new book of Constitutions of all the Grand Masters that could be collected from the beginning of time, together with a list of the names of all deputy Grand Masters, Grand Wardens, and the brethren that have served the craft in the quality of stewards, which was thought necessary because it was resolved that for the future, all grand officers except the Grand Master shall be selected out of that body. By that time, Anderson, of course, had completed his massive royal genealogies, which traces the family lines of most royal and many noble houses in human history on at least 4 continents, including mythological deified progenitors. Zeus? You want Zeus? We got Zeus. A comparison of the texts shows that he mined royal genealogy extensively for new materials to include in the 1738 constitutions, identifying the most glorious kings from each generation as the Grand Masters. Most of this was spurious, and as a result, the second edition of the Book of Constitution has caused tremendous mischief over time, introducing into Masonic history seemingly countless exaggerations, falsehoods, and irrelevant details, which are now so thoroughly embedded in historical accounts of English and American and Canadian Freemasonry that it's unlikely that they will ever be entirely sorted out. Anderson's deception, and we really must call it that, had more than one impetus. Surely it did not help that he was instructed to do the impossible or the implausible. Then we must note his energetic dedication to the task. Anderson's poverty at the time encouraged him to greatly enlarge the second edition of the Book of Constitutions so that it boasts 231 pages compared to the 91 of the first edition. The publishers for the second edition were Caesar Ward and Richard Chandler, and they, rather than Anderson, owned the copyright. They paid Anderson by the page for his composition, which was typical for the time. All were looking forward to brisk and profitable sales, especially as Grand Lodge gave its exclusive imprimatur to this volume. So Anderson succumbed to temptation, and he just stuffed the new edition with extraneous and often fictitious details, intended, sort of ironically, to lend an air of verisimilitude and to tighten up loose threads in the web. A certain amount of chaos ensued. The new Book of Constitutions contains many rather harmless fictions. A prime example is Anderson's report in the 1723 edition of the Constitutions of the laying of the foundation stone of St. Martin in the Fields, which had only happened the year before. Anderson's narrative, intending to demonstrate the flourishing state of Freemasonry under George I, is largely cribbed from contemporary newspaper accounts, which was what they did in those days. And it describes a civil and religious celebration. However, by 1738, Anderson has transformed the foundation stone ceremony into a thoroughly Masonic affair. Inserting fraternal flourishes into the account, omitting factual details that portrayed the event as anything other than a triumph for the craft. His recreation is not entirely successful, as he obscures the fact that there were actually two distinct ceremonies at St. Martin's in 1722. A civil and religious one in March, and 2 months later in May, a Masonic ceremony during which dignitaries laid a second foundation stone about 12 feet above the original. In the 1738 edition, we therefore read about a single event which incorporates factual details from both ceremonies, as well as a few embellishments of his own imagination. Or we might consider Anderson's fictitious provenance for the Grand Lodge Sword of State. In 1731, Thomas Howard, the 8th Duke of Norfolk, who died in 1732, and was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge, and he gave an antique sword to the Grand Lodge in the desire that it would be used as the official sword of state to be carried before the Grand Master in procession. Seizing the opportunity to transform this nice gift into a grand one, and a heroically Protestant one at that, Anderson claims in the 1738 edition of the Constitutions that this sword was the trusty old sword of Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, and was worn next by his successor in the war, the brave Duke of Saxe-Weimar, and both of their names are on the blade. This is a classic example of Anderson's well-documented penchant for invention, embellishment, and politicization. And like many other of his appealing myths, it stuck. This was, however, fake news. Thomas Howard was famously Catholic and would hardly have gone out of his way to connect the Grand Lodge with the great Protestant champion of the 30 Years' War. Many Masonic images like this of Norfolk's sword were subsequently engraved in various sizes and offered singly or bound into copies of the Book of Constitutions and the Freemason's Pocket Companion. The earliest such engraving is this one, executed by John Pine, who also did the frontispiece for the first Book of Constitution. Other engravers followed suit, with all subsequent images taking Pine's for their model, though with significant variations in size and detail. None mention Gustavus Adolphus until after 1738. When we get to Jonathan Scott's 1756 Book of Constitutions, he advertises an engraving of the sword for sale, writing, "It had been ye sword of Gustavus Adolphus, the valiant King of Sweden, and worn by him at the Battle of Luton, and afterwards by his brave successor in war, Bernard, Duke of Saxe-Weimar." This version of the sword myth, taken directly from Anderson's 1738 account, resonated within the fraternity. And at the time I wrote this presentation, the catalog of the Museum of the United Grand Lodge of England still described the Grand Master's sword with some ambiguity. The blade is reputed to have been found lying across the body of Gustavus Adolphus at the Battle of Lutzen, and was subsequently acquired by Thomas, the Duke of Norfolk. There was a cottage industry across Europe by the middle of the 17th century of making Gustavus Adolphus swords. I wrote a paper for this. It's hysterical. Gustavus Adolphus had a sword, of course, and they have it in Sweden, in the archives, in their armory museum. But there were two kinds of Masonic swords that were, not Masonic, excuse me, two types of Gustavus Adolphus swords that were made. Some of them look like, this Templar sword, right? And these always say Gustavus Adolphus, and they have various nifty symbols on it. And the other swords all look like scimitars, and they have magic sigils on them. And the Catholic sword makers sold the scimitars to gullible people because it was magic, and Gustavus Adolphus wasn't really that brave. He was protected by magic on the battlefield. And of course, the Christian Protestant swords are just, handsome, manly swords. And every now and then someone comes up with a Gustavus Adolphus sword and they take it to be authenticated, and they quietly drop their insurance policies on it. So, if the sword was a relatively harmless fabrication, Anderson also writes into the Masonic record consequential falsehoods by twisting facts and inventing details as part of his enlargement and refashioning of the Book of Constitutions in 1738. This is demonstrated most clearly by a close reading of Anderson's account of the Duke of Wharton's election as Grand Master, which is intentionally deceptive. So, did Anderson lie in the Book of Constitution? Yes, early and often. Anderson is clearly striving to make himself look more important and to make Wharton look more evil than he was. Anderson claims to have been Grand Warden at the time. He never was. He was acting Grand Warden, but that's different. More importantly, perhaps at the instigation of John Theophilus Desaguliers, Anderson was keen to denigrate the propriety of the Jacobite Duke of Wharton's election as Grand Master in 1722. As a result, the entire description of Wharton's election in the Book of Constitutions of 1738 is fiction. It's disproven by all other contemporary documentary evidence. More broadly, though, Anderson's willingness to do such violence to the truth in this instance adds weight to our skepticism about his reportage of other contemporary events. To do him justice, although Anderson was clearly guilty of deception, lying at some key points, in general, he probably undoubtedly saw himself as using what passed at the time for legitimate historical technique to reconcile and correct faulty evidence in most of the historical counts in the 1738 Book of Constitutions. He nevertheless got a good deal of it wrong. With additions like these, the historical section of the 1738 edition of Constitutions increases from about 10,000 words to over 200,000. Thus, it is ironic that this is the section of the Constitutions that stands as Anderson's most famous and influential historical writing. It's also the fullest example of his credentials as a participant in the early Scottish Enlightenment, as he brings together that movement's characteristic obsession with stadial history, that is, in clear, often named stages, chronology, origins, philology, antiquarianism, and a willingness to substitute conjecture for verifiable fact when evidence is lacking. And through the constitutions, Anderson transmitted those same methods and obsessions to millions of Freemasons the world over, encoding the DNA of the Scottish Enlightenment into English Freemasonry and its offspring for the rest of Masonic time. I digress. You knew that. Anderson's handling of religion in constitutions is equally interesting, but does not have the impact that he wanted to. I argue that all of the favored interpretations of Anderson's version of the first Masonic charge concerning God and religion are entirely opposite to what he meant. Anderson was briefer and more circumspect when he composed the 1723 constitutions. He was working under deadline, and if his claim is to be believed, which is anybody's guess, he was working under supervision. The first charge obliges the brethren to be moral, and neither atheist nor a stupid libertine. And what that means is to not be a Trinitarian. Words change in meaning over the years. We forget at our peril that the meaning of words is constantly in flux. At the time, and in a religious context, libertine meant a religious freethinker, someone who was not an Orthodox believer, someone who did not believe in the Trinity. Remember Anderson's obsession with the Trinity and orthopraxis. He goes on in this charge to assert that within that compass, denomination and persuasion are immaterial. As far as Anderson was concerned, if you came up to be a member of the lodge, you could be Anglican, you could be Huguenot, you could be Presbyterian, Independent, Dutch Reformed, your choice. Not Catholic, certainly not Catholic, and certainly not many other things as well. By 1738, seeing all too well that the libertines were gaining the upper hand, Anderson was more explicit. In the first charge, he repeats the earlier injunctions against atheists and libertines, but now he introduces the 3 great articles of Noah, which has consternated readers ever since. What the devil did he mean? Contemporary theological literature and even Anderson's other writings are replete with the 7 laws of Noah. But Anderson is very clear, repeating virtually the same phrase in the Constitution's historical section on Zoroaster, saying, "We leave every brother in liberty of conscience, but strictly charge him to carefully maintain the cement of the lodge and the 3 great articles of Noah." What are the 3 articles? Anderson has already told us. He told us in Unity and Trinity that the cement of Protestant Christian belief, as well as that of the patriarchs, is the original religion. Belief in the Trinity, revelation is contained in Holy Scripture, and an immortal soul. Nobody else needs to come knocking at the door. Why do James Anderson's religious convictions matter? If we're to understand the overlapping contexts that surround the founding and the early years of Grand Lodge Freemasonry, religious conflict is at the heart of the matter. Anderson, as a trained and dedicated warrior in the cause of Reformed Christianity, attempted to weaponize English Freemasonry, to make it another tool in the arsenal of righteousness, as Protestantism and Catholicism continued their century-old struggle across Europe. This tells us that from the very beginning, the culture of Grand Lodge Freemasonry was contested, and that the religion in which all men agree was in reality anything but that. The subsequent history of religious conflict within the English Grand Lodge and between the Grand Lodge of England and its many daughters and allies throughout the world has its origin in the very foundation of Grand Lodge Freemasonry, and beyond that should be seen as a current in the reverberations of the great wars of the Reformation. Thank you. I wondered if my voice and your patience would hold out, and I think we both made it. Thank you very much. I'm supposed to ask for questions now.
I believe so. You could advance the slides. Couple more, one more, and another time. So, I have a question for the technical team, first of all. Will everybody on the live stream be able to see me and hear me if I stand beside Susan? Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor Sommers, Susan, and thank you on behalf of us as well. If you are on the live stream, please be patient. There are several questions already there. I have a microphone, and I might ask for Ethan's help as a microphone runner. Are there any questions, first of all, from the audience? We do have time for questions, and already several. But anybody from the audience?
You could ask me afterwards.
Do you have a question? Yeah, okay, so Ethan will be the runner with the microphone and demonstrate by using it.
Okay, let's see here. It's working? Okay, there we go. My question.
Now, just a question for the team. Is it okay if we move around the audience, or should? Okay.
All right, my question, thank you so much once again for the presentation. Wonderful presentation. And I was just curious about, given his sort of antagonism to Catholicism, how did Anderson, did he address it all or sort of reconcile in his sort of genealogy from Adam to, his present day Catholic Freemasons in that time period? And
So he was a practical man, and he wanted to sell his book. And so that's one of the reasons why he said he lets every nation enjoy their own mythology. So he doesn't want to alienate Catholics who might want to buy his book. In fact, he thinks that's a wonderful idea. When we look at Freemasonry, what we have to understand is that Anderson was a very important figure in the creation of the culture of Grand Lodge. But ultimately, what really mattered was not what he wrote, but how Grand Lodge applied it, interpreted it. I think it's telling that after Anderson died in 1739, the next iteration, the next edition of the Constitutions went back to the previous one. It went back to 1723. So he was a bit of an outlier in all sorts of ways. He was a devout Calvinist. He loved science. He loved philosophy. He knew he was right. He knew he couldn't force everyone else to be right. He tried, but how did he reconcile? Well, he really didn't. He just sidestepped and said, here it is, do with it what you will, make sure I get paid. Yeah, practical man. Anybody else? You're all waiting until we have libations, don't you? And then you'll get your courage up.
I will ask a question on behalf of some of the people in the live stream. We have one or two questions from Marshall Kern. The first question is actually a detailed question about the publishing history of the constitutions. So the question is, there are two other authors and publishers of Masonic constitutions, J. Roberts in 1722 and Benjamin Cole in 1728. Both these trace the origin of Freemasonry to Noah and Adam. And then the question comes, did James Anderson know either of these other contributors, Roberts and Cole? And what's the connection, I guess?
Yeah. So I know more about Roberts, who heard that Grand Lodge was creating this book of constitutions and was going to come out. And he was a Freemason, and he hurried up and printed his own that was shorter and cost less, and he claimed that it was more authentic. So there was a grudge between Roberts and Anderson. I don't know that they knew each other, but they certainly knew of each other. I don't know Cole. If my friend Andrew Prescott was here, he would tell you all about it, because one of his specialties is looking at the permutations of the publication of the constitutions. But yes, you know, as soon as Anderson comes out with this handbook, there's a new genre that's born, a new way to make money. This is wonderful. So yeah, they knew about each other, and they copied from each other, and they said not very nice things about each other, and that's the publishing world in the 18th century.
Now, you have mentioned some of the intrigues behind the publication. Here's a question which might also suggest some intrigues. I'll let you take a look at it. And then we have an answer to the question. Do you mind reading it out and responding to it?
Well, let me find it. Many believe that Anderson stole the Constitution from Desaguliers. Nah, Desaguliers had a really good gig.
So maybe explain the relationship.
Okay, so Desaguliers, another one of the really important early figures in Grand Lodge. He was a Huguenot. He had been smuggled into, I think, Jersey, Guernsey, one of the islands, as an infant at the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, when Protestants were forced to leave. He was raised in England. He was ordained in the Anglican Church, so he was an Anglican priest. He had a wonderful gig teaching Newtonian ideas. So he was a disciple of Isaac Newton. He built machines that demonstrated the principles of Newton's discoveries. And he gave lecture courses and demonstrations for the king and for Masonic lodges and in pubs, and you know. So he really did a lot to popularize Newton's ideas. He took an interest in Anderson. He was one of Anderson's pallbearers when he died, the only Mason to be one of his pallbearers. All the others were dissenting nonconformist ministers, like Anderson was himself. Desaguliers was of a higher social status than Anderson, who after all was a Scot, you know. And it seems unavoidable that they worked closely together to compile the first book of Constitution. There's another figure we have to talk about, and that was George Payne, who was an administrator in the government and who wrote and then delivered the original regulations. And then Anderson takes all of his history and he takes Payne's regulations and he smushes them through the meat grinder that was Anderson's way of writing. And Desaguliers put a dedication on the front, and hey presto, we have the Book of Constitutions. So they worked closely together. They were good friends. Desaguliers was one of the only ones who really stuck with Anderson through his pretty humiliating latter years. So no, he didn't steal them, but they did work together.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I go back to the live stream for questions, if you have a question at any point, just hold your hand up the next time there is a pause, okay? Or right now. Now, we have a question about the image that you showed from one of the texts about the Trinity, I believe. In his preface to the book on the Trinity, Anderson mentions that it is against modern Jews. How was it his opinion on Jewish Masons who were already joining the Masons?
Yeah, so he says he's against modern Jews because the old ones, of course, were actually Scots Presbyterians.
Of course.
Of course, you know, anyone with any sense would be. But he stops that with Noah. And he said that, you know, Noah taught his sons, taught his family the right religion, and then they scattered across the face of the earth, and they lost that direct transition from God to man. And instead it became man to man, and you know, we have terrible memories, don't we? We forget things. We repeat it wrong. It's like a giant game of spiritual telephone. And so the old Jews, they were good. The new Jews are just as misled as everybody else, except the Scots Presbyterians. Does that do it?
I think so, yes. So thank you. And now we have a few other interesting questions here. Here's a big question, I guess, that follows up on your lecture, Professor Sommers, the last one. So how are we supposed to interpret, as Masons, the Anderson constitutions? Not as gospel, but rather with a grain of salt.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Trust but verify? Yeah, Anderson was not an incorrigible liar, but we can never really be sure which Anderson is talking to us. So you have to look for other sources that validate what he's saying. By and large, it's all good ideas, even if he was making them up. Yeah.
I have a communication from the audience. I'd like to say thank you to Andrew Prescott, our Sankey lecturer from a few years back, who has a clarification to follow up.
Thank you.
On your comments, Susan. This is about the discussion of Benjamin Cole, one of the other publishers involved in the early publishing of Masonic documents. And Professor Prescott says, Benjamin Cole's edition of the Constitutions was a version of the old charges, that is, the old medieval texts that were the starting point for Anderson's works. So the relationship then is a collaborative one. They were both doing different branches of the initial Masonic historical work.
And Anderson wouldn't have liked that one bit.
Because he wanted to be the sole.
He wanted to sell books.
Aha.
If someone else is selling books, he isn't, yeah.
So, okay. I'll pause just to take a look around the
There
audience.
was a hand up over there, yeah.
Okay, could I ask Ethan to pass on the microphone?
Sure thing. Just that way. Let's go this way around.
And he's rounding the bases.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. You had mentioned that after Anderson's passing, that they revert to the 1923 constitutions. Were there any implications to his 1938 constitutions that impacted Masonic, I guess you could say, research from that point?
You mean 1738?
Yes, my error, 1738, yes.
Yeah, there really was. There really was. Can I go with the first part of your question, and then if you have more?
Yep.
So in the 19th century, when Quator Coronati, the first research lodge, was established in London, history was becoming scientific everywhere. And the members of Quator Coronati recognized that Anderson was really a problem, that he was the only author, the only source for lots of early Grand Lodge events. And they understood that he was really unreliable. And they had to come up, you know, we've got to use him, but how can we use him? And so they sort of drew a line and said, before 1717, he's not reliable. And after 1717, he's reliable. And we've been stuck with that ever since. So yes, it has had a tremendous effect on Masonic research, starting with something simply as basic as the correct dating of the foundation of Grand Lodge.
Thank you for that. And I guess a quick follow-up would be, were there any disciples of Anderson following his passing? When I say disciples, I mean people who carried on his research or deemed it to be true, or did it just kind of die with him?
The work that he was doing was, in many cases, you know, he's sort of on the cutting edge of the Scottish Enlightenment in theory, but actually he was a bad writer, and it's really hard to untangle what he's trying to say in many cases. If you've waded through the 1738 constitutions and you're puzzled, there's a reason for that. You know, even his own contemporaries didn't think he was a very good writer. And his brother, Adam, who wrote The Universal History of British Commerce, is a beautiful writer. You wouldn't believe they came out of the same family and through the same educational system, but they certainly did. So, you know, we see people like George Oliver picking up Anderson's threads in the 19th century, but George Oliver makes everything up too. So it's not a good path.
Thank you very much.
I'm just testing this microphone out. Can you hear me on this microphone? Yeah? Are there any other questions from the audience?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. You mentioned about his credibility as a person, because he was a kind of person who tend to lie a lot. He went to prison, something like that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm just very curious to know if you discovered anything else about his life that it wasn't out louded and nobody knows.
Yeah. Well, you'll need to buy my book, which I haven't published yet. I keep finding new things about Anderson. He was a name dropper. He was a gossip. He ran through his money and his wife's money, and he invested in a failed scheme to weave tapestries using only 3 colors. He spent a lot of money on tapestries that he should have been spending on paying his publisher for royal genealogies. He appears to have been in on a racket selling DD degrees, Doctorate of Divinity degrees, to Anglican clergymen and taking a cut. So that's sort of unfortunate. Yeah, he went to debtor's prison at a time when that was not a fun place. He owed over 500 pounds, which is just an astonishing amount of money in those days. And usually people of his stature, ministers, didn't go to debtor's prison, or if they did, they weren't there very long. He was there 3 years. And that indicates that nobody in his church or the Grand Lodge or his wealthy brother would help get him out. And once he did get out, his health was broken, and he died, in about a year and a half. So, yeah, he had problems. But he was bright, and he was, I want to say he was a good Mason. He was a good Presbyterian. I think even though he lost his congregation, they didn't really cut ties with him entirely. It's not like they said, yeah, we don't want you anymore. They waited until after he was out of prison, and he made noises about coming back to be their minister again. And they said, no, we can't do that. But even then, they negotiated pension for him. So, yeah, he was like all of us. Makes mistakes, does dumb things.
We have about maybe 5 more minutes. Do you think we can last for 5 more minutes with questions?
Only if I get to pick them.
I have one myself.
Okay, why don't we?
But here's one here, and I will ask a question in the meantime. So this is a question related to the eyeglasses that you have on. You mentioned that you have spent a lot of time reading documents very closely, often in microfilm form. I'm curious, as a historian, not as a Mason, and as a teacher of history and of research, if you could give students, but also members of the public, an insight into the process, you teach methodology and history research methods. What is your particular approach? What are the steps you've taken that stand out maybe for a general audience?
Yeah.
What's the behind the scenes and under the hood work that goes on to get to a research project result like yours?
So the first and most important thing is to get a good question. All research is aiming to the answer of a question. So you have to get a good question. And it's really hard to just say, gosh, what is it about Freemasonry that excites me? It's the great unknown. It's what does G mean? That's not a good research question. It's hard to find documentary evidence. You'll never know whether you have found out the truth or not. What I do typically is I find that one research project delivers the next one. And so when I was a doctoral candidate. My advisor said, I've just got the library to buy 100 years of Suffolk County, England newspapers. Read them all and come up with a research topic. So I'm reading 100 years worth of microfilm, and but that project led to the next, which led to the next. And you develop a sort of an internal sense, you know, a tingle of the nose or something that says, ooh, this is fun, this is exciting. I have no idea where I'm going, but I know that I will be able to get there eventually. It's sort of like putting together a puzzle without a picture. So the first and most important thing is to find a good research question. And as one of my professors told me once, when some guy in class, you know, came up with this huge, long, complicated research proposal, and my professor said, so what? You need to be able to say, so what? Yes, this is important. This leads to that and leads to the other thing, but so what? If you can answer so what easily, maybe it's not a good research question. And after that, you use all sorts of other techniques and all sorts of other resources. But I think the most important thing is to get a good research question, and you don't necessarily get it quickly or easily. You can have to nose around to try to find it for a long time. The last time I was here, or the first time I was here, I was talking about Thomas Dunkerley. And when I started my project on Dunkerley, I wasn't interested in Dunkerley. I was interested in Ebenezer Sibley, who was one of Dunkerley's sidekicks. And I thought, you know, Dunkerley is much better known than Sibley. I'll look at Dunkerley, and this will help me figure out what Sibley was up to. Because the guy got burned in effigy. You know, that just doesn't happen to everybody. And I started reading Dunkerley's story, and I said, no, that's not how things worked in the 18th century. These stories are flawed. These explanations are wrong. There's a better answer to that. So I didn't actually invent my research subjects. I found them, or they found me. Does that work?
Thank you, yeah. Last chances for questions for Professor Sommers.
I will be here later, too.
Yes,
Yes, the fellow sitting on the aisle, yes, you were first.
We have a few more minutes of the presentation and formalities, and then we will join Professor Sommers at a reception if you have time. Please come introduce yourselves.
But only if you liked my talk. Yeah.
Very interesting lecture. But I would like to ask, when researching the sources of Anderson's constitution, have you ever encountered the name of the last Moravian bishop, Jan Amos Komensky, also known as Comenius? The reason I am asking because many Czech and German researchers periodically bring up that it might be a possibility that certain ideas from his writings were an inspiration for Anderson.
I did not drill down deeply into his history itself and the sources that he used. I know what was in his library. I know what kind of education he had. He certainly would have been familiar with, what was going on on the continent and in Byzantium and, all of those places. And he was very democratic about where he took ideas from. So I can't tell you for sure that that's what happened, but I wouldn't be at all surprised. Thank you all for coming.
There's maybe one more question if you have time.
I have time. I'm not sure if I have any more good answers, but we can try. This fellow was
yeah.
waving his hand.
Christopher, do you have a question? Wait, could you wait for the microphone? This will be the last question.
It was just a follow-up to what you were saying earlier about your research and the question, coming up with good questions to the research. So if you can remember or what the question was or pinpoint where you started working on the Anderson presentation you've got today.
That's easy. So they were having a great big, wonderful conference in 2017 at Cambridge University on the 300th anniversary of the founding of Grand Lodge. And I wanted to go to a conference at Cambridge. And I mean, I really did. It was great. And so Andrew, who lives in England, and I said, okay, what do we really know about this founding event that Anderson describes as the 4 old lodges meeting in the Apple Tree Tavern on I forget the name of the street right now. But we went into tax records to find out if there was a tavern there. And then we checked all the other factual things that Anderson mentions in that story, which is all in 1738 edition of the Constitutions. And we kept finding, can I say a bad word?
Does Professor Sommers have permission? I'm seeing some nods. Okay.
He made up crazy shit. And we were going into the tax records, and we were going into the guild records, and we were going into marriage and baptism records and wills. And there were so many things that just couldn't have been. You know, you name a tavern and, oh gosh, it wasn't really a tavern there in 1717, but it was a tavern there in 1735. Or so-and-so was, you know, the head of a guild. Well, he wasn't the head of a guild in 1717, but he was in 1736. So we realized, you know, a few months into the project that that story was bunk, and that we couldn't take anything on face value. We couldn't take what Anderson was saying. And, you know, my question was, you know, did he ever think these things? I mean, was he delusional or was he desperate? And I don't think he was crazy, although, you know, those 2 pamphlets, which I did not read to you, there were 2 pamphlets published in 1720, which I talked about at the beginning. Those 2 are written in verse, and they are about him getting a very bad case of syphilis. And you know, lots of people had a bad case of syphilis in those days, and it does affect your brain. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. And if you would like to learn more about the Apple Tree Tavern and this research that Professor Sommers was mentioning, go to the Sankey Lectures website and look for the 2016 lecture by Andrew Prescott. There'll be a lot more details there that follow up on the answer. And that's also the point of inspiration then we learn for this
Yeah, I just wanted to go to Cambridge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And now I'd like to welcome to the podium Grand Master Jamie Ireland to say a few words on behalf of the Grand Lodge.
Michael, can I kick this thing in?
You can lift it in, yes. Just watch out for the cord.
I'm going to trip on it if I don't do something. Well, that's better. Past Grand Master, I see you up there. Professor Michael Dredger, Professor Sommers, Ethan Monsione, sorry. Brethren, ladies, gentlemen, and guests, on behalf of the Grand Lodge of Canada and the Province of Ontario and the current Grand Lodge officers present with us here today, I bring greetings to you all, as well as my own personal greetings and warm wishes. Professor Michael Dredger, I want to thank you so much for spearheading our partnership between Grand Lodge and Brock University. We've been working together for a long time. And what did you say, 17 years?
This is the 17th year of the lecture series, yes.
Excellent. I thank you for your dedication, your patience, and everything in putting this together and working with us.
Thank you, too.
Professor Susan Sommers, oh my goodness, what a presentation that was. I know when we talked this morning, I was asking about Anderson, Goose and Gridiron in 1717 and where we're going from there. And oh my goodness, I think you've put us into a tailspin here. Just the name Anderson is something that we talk about, we think about all the time. And now I'm thinking he's just a guy with syphilis that wants to sell books. So, oh my goodness.
Also brings this tradition of Scottish Freemasonry down to England, and that's so important.
And now that I believe I'm Scottish, I'm okay with that part. Absolutely, but what an interesting presentation. I thank you so much for your research into that. You must have had some good days and bad days putting this one together.
Yeah, I say, oh my goodness, every time I start to uncover things about Anderson. It's, oh my goodness.
I bet. And every time I hear the name James Anderson now, I am going to think of you and about this presentation. I thank you very much. I want to thank Nicole for everything you do as well to carry on our partnership with Grand Lodge. It means a lot to us to be with Brock University. It absolutely does. Ethan, thank you for your presentation. That is an interesting topic as well, because you are absolutely correct. Food is what drives the world, whether it's war, peace, whatever it is. You are doing outstanding research, young man, and I thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Michael Martin, Victor Travers, the education pillar at our Grand Lodge. Jim, I want to thank you all for putting this together. It's great, absolutely great. Victor, you and your team there, the Mind Press, I want to thank them. Live streaming has become a huge part of the Sankey lecture. It's not that many years ago when we wanted to try live streaming, and it was said that, well, that's going to take away from our lectures, from our presentation, and I think it's done the opposite. I think it's added so much to it. It's added, I'm not sure the numbers of our audience now, but I think it's incredibly
We
higher.
had about 70 people online, and I'm trying to get, if you're online, still, could you, and you're watching with a group, could you please tell us how many people are watching with you? That would be a big help, because I imagine we have many more than 70 people.
Absolutely. I think some of those ones online, they're hosting education days, and we're not just sure how many numbers are there. I would love to hear that number, just so we can take this back to management and actually say we had this many people at our Sankey lecture. To the brethren that have taken time out of your day, out of your weekend to come and sit here with us and listen to this wonderful presentation, I thank you so much. And for the ones that are doing it virtually, again, thank you so much for helping us out with this. To the Brock History Department, you have a treasure here at the university in the library. It is just a collection of amazing Masonic stuff, and we love to, I'm thinking we have access to it. And
Yes.
we love to. Can you explain that just for a second?
So the basis of the relationship, the partnership, and the friendship between the Grand Lodge and the university is not the Sankey lecture initially, but Charles Sankey's private book and manuscript collection, which Charles Sankey donated to the university starting many years ago, and it's been added to over the years. It's part of our special collections and archives, a wonderful place on the 10th floor of the library. And if you would like to visit it with maybe a small group of people to see the Sankey Masonic collection or some of the treasures from it, you can contact archives@brocku.ca to arrange a visit, or you can write to me, Mike Dreger, via the history department. I'm the only Mike in the history department faculty list. So you can go online, look up my email, or write to Mike Martin or the education committee and arrange a visit. So that's you are right, Jamie, it's a wonderful treasure for our students and for the community at large.
Absolutely, and I thank you so much for that invitation for all the membership of Ontario Masons to use that. It would be wonderful to get in there and to see what's there. I would love for that to happen. Did I mention the Brock students?
We have several around the room.
Yes.
I won't force anybody to stand up, but we have students here, several of whom have volunteered, and I will introduce them to Professor Sommers afterwards.
Excellent, excellent. Love having the students here as well.
We have more online as well.
It's everyone knows or it's said that Masonry is a society of secrets, but that's absolutely not true.
The secrets are all up in the archives, so they're open to the community.
Online, there is no secrets on there. Now, whether it's all true or not, this goes back to your presentation. That's for you to find out. So I want to thank the students for taking time out of their weekends as well to be with us. With that being said, I'll introduce our Deputy Grand Master, Right Worship Brother Art DeCecco. It's great to have him here with us. I love attending events with him. Thank you so much, sir. And I will say we will connect across the hall for the get-together.
I will have details in just a moment about the reception. It won't take very much longer, but there's not much time separating you from food.
There's just me right now.
Right, and then no, you're not the final barrier, Grand Master, it is me.
Okay. My final thank you so much to everybody. Safe travels. God bless you and your families, and have a great day. Thank you.
Just as a last step or two, I would like to, this is for just a moment from now, I would like to thank all of you online and in person here for attending the lecture. I will turn this other mic off. I hope that makes things easier. We're good? Good. So thank you very much for attending. Please join us after for a reception. It'll be right across the hall. If you've been here to a reception before in the last few years, you know that you can simply go to Nicole's in the back. You can follow Nicole and our student volunteers who will help you find the stairs. If anybody has mobility issues and would prefer not to go down a set of stairs. Nicole can help you find the elevator, which will take you down to our market area where we have some refreshments. Before we do that, I would like to say, as a preview, we have a lecturer already arranged for next year. This is Amanda Brown-Perroy, who is from one of our other great Masonic research connections. Amanda Brown-Perroy is an expert on Masonic secrets. So if you want to learn more about the history of Masonic secrets and the culture of Masonic secrets, come next year. We don't have a date yet. We don't have a title yet for the talk, but we will be announcing details soon. About this time next year, anticipate another Sankey lecture. Dr. Brown-Perroy comes from Bordeaux, France, where she studied with Professor Cécile Révalger, who many of you will know from past lectures. So we're looking very much forward to that. Amanda Brown-Perroy was in California as the keynote speaker to Professor Sommers' conference just a week ago, just last week. So that is a preview for an event next year. And as a last bit of ceremony, I would like to present a gift both to Susan Sommers for giving us her time and her expertise. This is a bottle of Black Bank Hill Fraternité, a nice local white wine with a fraternal name. Thank you very much, Susan, on behalf of the university. And I would also like to invite the Grand Master to come up to the front as well to accept a bottle of the same wine as a sign of our fraternity.
Can we all? Me be in the middle? Yes.
And after a picture, we will pause just one moment and then okay, thank you, everybody. A big thank you from my part to repeat Jamie Ireland's thanks to the technical team, to Victor and everybody else on the team, to Milan, who's out in the big ether. Please join us afterwards if you can. If not, safe travels home. And if you're online still, thank you so much for joining us. See you soon on the other side of the reception.